Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. This time, we're going to get into something that'll give even the biggest horror buff chills. We're talking about cursed films. You know, all those stories about movies that seem to attract seriously bad vibes. Accidents, strange events, even deaths. And not just on set either. We're talking about stuff happening off screen too. Seriously weird, unsettling stuff. So we're diving headfirst into a YouTube video essay that breaks down this whole creepy phenomenon. This video essay zeroes in on audience members who had, well, let's just say they had less than pleasant experiences. Unexplained deaths, freaky occurrences, you name it. This essay's got it all. So the question is, are we really putting ourselves under a curse every time we hit play on a horror flick? Or is it just our brains getting a little too caught up in the scares? Let's find out, shall we? So this video essay starts off by talking about how horror kind of gives us a safe way to experience fear. You know, like that classic Alfred Hitchcock thing where the suspense is way scarier when you don't actually see the monster right away. But then the narrator throws this curveball and asks, what if that sense of safety is just an illusion? And if that wasn't creepy enough, they bring in Ed and Lorraine Warren, you know, the paranormal investigators. And they firmly believed that horror movies were like homing beacons for negative energy.
Yeah, the Warrens were a huge deal, especially back in the 70s and 80s. They really shaped how people viewed the paranormal. Haunted houses, demonic possessions, they investigated it all. And a lot of their cases ended up as material for books and movies, which, just further blurred those lines between reality and the supernatural.
Right. And the essay uses their perspective to introduce some of the most infamous, cursed films. Poltergeist, The Omen, The Exorcist. Those titles are practically synonymous with stories of tragic, unexplained events involving the cast and crew.
And it's really interesting. The sheer number of these stories, particularly within the horror genre, might be a big reason why people buy into them so easily. Our brains are wired to look for patterns. So when we hear a bunch of stories about, say, horror movies having all these strange occurrences, we're more likely to think there's something to it, even if there are perfectly logical explanations.
It's easy to get caught up in the spooky stuff and forget about the practical side of things.
Exactly. Like filmmaking itself is a demanding gig, right? Long hours, location shoots, working with equipment that can be dangerous. All of those things can lead to accidents or health problems, regardless of what kind of movie you're making. But when it happens on a horror set, people are much quicker to jump to a more sinister conclusion.
Makes sense. But then the essay takes this even creepier turn, like way creepier. It starts talking about audience members being affected by these so-called curses. And that's where things get really unsettling. Like this one case from Peru. A man was watching the newest Exorcist movie and suddenly died. No medical explanation, just gone. And witnesses even said he started convulsing in sync with the scene in the movie.
That's the kind of detail that stays with you, It plays on those primal fears about the power of what we watch. I mean, could something we see on screen actually have a physical effect on us? It's a question that's been around since, like, the dawn of cinema.
Right. It's like that urban legend about the person who died from a heart attack during the shower scene in Psycho. It's never been proven, but the story just won't die.
Exactly. They become like modern-day folklore, passed down and exaggerated over time. But like with any good mystery, we've got to look past the initial shock and think about other explanations.
So should we be skeptical of these audience-related stories too, then?
I'd say it's always a good idea to approach any extraordinary claim with a healthy amount of skepticism. We have to consider the source. In the case of that Exorcist incident, it was a newspaper article. And newspapers, while they do aim for accuracy, they also love a sensational story.
Okay, fair enough. Can't always believe everything you read, especially when it comes to these kinds of stories.
Right. And even if the events did happen exactly as described, without concrete proof that the death was caused by the movie, well, we can't rule out other possibilities. It could have been an undiagnosed health condition or just a tragic coincidence.
True. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't necessarily mean one caused the other.
Exactly. Classic example of correlation not equaling causation. But our brains are always trying to connect the dots, always searching for patterns, even when there might not be any.
So where does that leave us? With a bunch of spooky stories, but also this need to think critically, it's a tough balance.
It really is.
Yes.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It forces us to confront our own beliefs, our assumptions, and our relationship with the unknown.
Okay, everyone, buckle up for the next chilling tale. This one goes back to 1955 and involves a 9-year-old boy who died while watching The Creature from the Black Lagoon. The kid was perfectly healthy, then bam, a burst artery right when the creature makes its big reveal.
Now this one's really interesting because it raises the possibility unsettling as it is, that strong emotions could be physically triggering, like extreme fear or excitement, especially for someone with an underlying medical condition. It's not common, but it can happen.
So even if we put the paranormal aside for a moment, there's a chance these deaths, while tragic, might have a scientific explanation.
Exactly. Our understanding of how the mind and body connect is constantly evolving, but we do know they're deeply linked, and the way they interact can be incredibly complex.
Wow. That's both amazing and a little terrifying. Okay, everyone, brace yourselves because what I'm about to tell you is the most bizarre and unsettling story yet. And it involves a certain horror sequel you might have seen. Get ready, because we're headed to India, where a man died while watching The Conjuring 2. And the circumstances surrounding his death are just eerie. So this guy's watching the movie, right in the middle of it, and he just grabs his chest, starts complaining about this pain. People said he kept repeating, it has me, over and over. At first, everyone around him probably thought he was just caught up in the movie, just reacting to a scary scene. But then he died, right there in the theater.
Yeah, it's easy to see how a story like that, with a whole horror movie setting, could take on a life of its own.
Oh, absolutely. And it gets weirder. The doctors, they couldn't figure out what killed him. The only strange thing they found was that he had bitten off and swallowed his own tongue.
It's interesting, isn't it? That kind of detail, gruesome as it is, it really shows how our brains latch on to vivid images. We zero in on the shocking, visceral stuff, even if it might have been exaggerated or changed over time.
Like a game of telephone, but with scary stories. Each time it gets retold, there's a new layer, a new detail, and it just gets scarier and scarier.
Exactly. Plus, we're getting this story through so many different lenses. The witnesses, the authorities, the media. It's easy for the information to get a little skewed along the way.
Okay, so we've got this tragic, unexplained death. But then it gets really bizarre. The ambulance that was taking the man's body, it vanished, disappeared, no trace.
Now that's something else entirely. We go from an unsettling death to a full-blown disappearance. It adds a whole other level of mystery, wouldn't you say?
So now we're dealing with two mysteries.
Possibly, yeah. We don't have enough information to say for sure if they're connected, the death and the vanishing ambulance. They're both shrouded in mystery. It's tempting to connect the dots, especially given the circumstances. But we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions just because the two events happen close together.
So we're left with more questions than answers then.
It seems that way. But that doesn't mean these stories are pointless. They show us how fascinated we are by the unknown, our need to make sense of the world, even when we encounter things that defy explanation.
We're hardwired to tell stories, especially scary ones, right? But how much is based in reality, and how much is our imagination?
That's the million-dollar question. It's like that old debate, do we find patterns because they're actually there, or do we create them to make sense of chaos?
And when we're talking about horror movies, the line between real and imagined can get super blurry, super fast.
No doubt. Horror plays with our perceptions, our fears, our deepest anxieties. It lets us explore these dark corners of our minds from a safe distance.
But the question still lingers. Can those anxieties, those intense emotions, actually affect us physically?
Scientists and philosophers have been wrestling with that question for ages. We're learning more and more about the connection between mind and body all the time. We know that stress can show up as physical symptoms, right? Headaches, muscle tension, even heart palpitations. So is really that far-fetched to think that the intense emotions of a horror film, the fear, the adrenaline, could trigger something more serious, especially in someone who's already vulnerable?
It's both fascinating and a little scary to think about. So even if we completely ignore the paranormal angle for a second, there's still a chance that some of these deaths, tragic as they are, could have a scientific cause.
Exactly. The human body is incredibly complex. We're learning new things about it all the time. What seems like a coincidence today could have a perfectly logical explanation tomorrow.
It's a good reminder that we don't know everything. And sometimes the most compelling mysteries are the ones that stay unsolved.
I'd have to agree with you there. It's tempting to search for concrete proof, to try and label these events as either real or fake. But sometimes the most interesting answer is we just don't know.
It's a humbling thought, but it also makes you want to learn more, to explore.
Absolutely. Embracing the unknown, recognizing the limits of what we know, and never stopping questioning. That's where the real excitement is.
Okay, I have to admit, I love a good scary movie, but this deep dive has got me thinking about sleeping with the lights on tonight.
That's a perfectly natural reaction. We're instinctively cautious of the dark, the unknown. It's part of what's kept us humans around for so long.
Fear can be a powerful motivator, though. It can push us to learn to understand the world around us better. And that brings us to the core of what we're talking about today. Are these stories of cursed films just spooky entertainment? Or do they reveal something deeper about us? About the power of our minds, the things we believe in, and the mysteries we may never fully solve? We'll be back in a flash to wrap up our deep dive into the eerie world of cursed cinema. And we are back. We've gone deep, deep into these creepy stories of cursed films, haven't we? But before we call it a night, I wanted to share some of your stories. We asked you if you'd ever experienced anything strange while watching a horror movie, and let me tell you, you guys did not disappoint.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? How these personal stories often line up with the themes we've been talking about. The power of suggestion, how our minds search for patterns, that primal fear of the unknown that horror movies are so good at tapping into.
Exactly. Like one listener, Sarah, wrote in about watching The Ring. You know, that one with the creepy videotape?
Oh yeah, classic. That imagery really gets to you.
Right. So Sarah's watching, and just as the scary girl crawls out of the TV, her phone rings. Caller ID, unknown. Talk about perfect timing.
Isn't it amazing how our brains can latch on to those little coincidences, especially when we're already spooked? Suddenly, something totally normal, like a phone call, feels terrifying.
It's like when you hear a noise after watching a scary movie and your mind just goes wild.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to look out for danger. When we're on edge, we're way more likely to see threats everywhere, even if they're not really there.
We also heard from John, who had a similar thing happen while he was watching The Conjuring. Right at the climax of the movie, every single light in his house went out. Turned out to be a blown fuse, but still spooky timing.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Those moments of, did that really just happen? Did the movie cause it? Or are we just connecting dots that aren't really there?
That seems to be the question, doesn't it? Coincidence or something more? So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I gotta ask, what's the final word on cursed films? Is there really some supernatural force at work, or are we just letting our imaginations run a little too wild?
If I had a straight answer for you, I think I'd be writing books, not having this conversation. But honestly, like with a lot of things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
In the middle ground.
Yeah. We don't have any hard proof that curses are real or that some unseen force is messing with these films. But we can't ignore the power of the human mind. What we believe, what we expect, it all shapes how we see the world.
So you're saying we might be subconsciously creating these curses ourselves?
It's a possibility. Think about the placebo effect. People experience real, measurable changes based on nothing but their belief in a treatment, even if the treatment itself doesn't actually do anything.
That's a really interesting point. So maybe when it comes to these stories of cursed films, it's not about proving or disproving the supernatural. Maybe it's about understanding how our minds, our bodies, and the stories we tell ourselves all come together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's way more interesting than a simple yes or no answer, don't you think? The unknown, the unexplainable, that's where true curiosity thrives.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the best we can do is keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep our minds open to possibilities.
Couldn't agree more. Embrace the mystery. The next time you get that shiver down your spine during a scary movie, remember, it's all part of the fun.
This has been the Deep Dive, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this unsettling adventure. Until next time, stay curious.